Virgin and the dead Christ. She is mourning his death, and that is generally, in art history parlance, called a pietà. This is a joint production between Michelangelo and Sebastiano, with Michelangelo providing the drawings for the figures, and Sebastiano painting the figures and the landscape. We have one drawing to show how Michelangelo prepared the figure of the Virgin, and it is over here. It's a red chalk drawing with black chalk and pen and ink, various studies of clasped hands. These are very difficult to draw, so Michelangelo made sure he got it right. And then he has the torso here of a male model. He was working from a live model here. And that eventually made it into the painting in the form of the Virgin. What Michelangelo and Sebastiano probably did is that Michelangelo gave Sebastiano a number of finished drawings that Sebastiano then worked up to a full-size, so-called cartoon, a full-size drawing that he transferred onto the panel and then started coloring. What's really exceptional in terms of Sebastiano's contribution is the coloring. He gives a real sensuality to the dead skin of Christ, who is placed right in front of us, and that is on the altar, because there would have been an altar underneath this. So when the believers in the chapel would take Eucharist, symbolically eating the body of Christ, they would be looking at this extremely sensual body of the dead Christ. What's extremely affecting about the image, I think, is the fact that Mary is sitting there alone in the night with a dead son laid in front of her. It boils down to that. It's a really simple, very, very strong image of a mother alone having lost her child. And I think that is so powerful. There are, of course, theological reasons for it looking the way it does. It is more complicated than just that. But really, that is what it boils down to. And accentuating this is the landscape, which Sebastiano has painted with an incredible freedom of brushwork. It's almost completely liquid brushwork. When you look at it closely, it's like an impressionist painting, centuries before the fact, of this landscape illuminated by the moonlight and with a faint glow on the horizon, which is probably the sunset. Above Mary is the moon peering through the clouds with dark clouds passing over it, but there's a patch of blue up there with the night sky. And Mary looks that way, and in that gaze upwards there's some hope. This painting caused a sensation in Rome. It was painted they started working on it in 1512, probably, and it was finished around, well, a few years later. It was certainly finished by 1516. Michelangelo at this point was finishing the Sistine Chapel ceiling when Sebastiano started painting this. And the reason why the two got together was that Michelangelo was not interested in painting like this. He was not interested in oil paint and the atmospheric effects that could be achieved with oil paint and the effects of light and shade. And Sebastiano was a master of that. So Michelangelo and Sebastiano figured out that they'd get together and create images together in this way, because then they could create something truly remarkable, and something that was more remarkable than the main rival in Rome at the time, who was Raphael, another great, great artist, who was there, and who was increasingly threatening Michelangelo's position, or so Michelangelo at least felt. He was very paranoid. And he felt that Raphael was really threatening his position as the premier artist in Rome, because he was, at least in the domain of painting, and people kind of tended to prefer Raphael's painting, which was more naturalistic, closer to life, whereas Michelangelo's painting, as seen on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, is very bright and expressive, but not as nuanced and naturalistic as Raphael's painting. But Sebastiano could do that, and the idea was for them to get together and compete with Raphael on those terms, with Sebastiano's great mastery of oil painting giving life to Michelangelo's highly sophisticated, memorable arrangement of figures. Let's walk around here behind the painting, because there's something very interesting to look at there. This is the back of the panel, which we're displaying here. And you see that there are charcoal drawings, figure studies, head studies, other little doodles of various sorts. These are probably by the two artists. Both Michelangelo and Sebastiano drew here. And this really suggests the closeness of their collaboration at this time. They were both hanging around this panel and throwing away ideas, of showing each other how things could be done, or just sort of spitballing live on the panel here. And what's interesting is that a few of the sketches that you see here, notably that figure, the sleeping figure up there, is an early sketch for the last part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling that Michelangelo would go on to paint. So I imagine that Sebastiano was borrowing studio space in Michelangelo's house. Michelangelo at that time was working across what is now St. Peter's Square in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican Palace. So there's a real closeness, and this vividly brings it to life. It's fascinating. I also imagine that it's unclear, but that it's speculation, but that Sebastiano was invited up onto the scaffolding as Michelangelo was finishing this, putting the last parts of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. And that really, seeing Michelangelo paint those last parts with this extremely expressive brushwork. At that time he was so confident. He had painted most of the ceiling, so he could just go from little sketches and just paint straight on the wall, not having to prepare cartoons and so on. And that would have set off a creative explosion in Sebastiano's mind. And that is reflected in their next great work, which we see in here, in this great room where we see the glory of Rome in the 15 teens, as expressed by Michelangelo and Sebastiano. This great painting, which belongs to the National Gallery and is really the occasion for the exhibition. This is the first inventorized work in the gallery's collection. It was part of the original acquisition that founded the National Gallery in 1824. So it's our NG #1, and it was commissioned 500 years ago this year. It is the raising of Lazarus. So it's the story from the Gospel of Christ coming to revive his friend who had died 4 years previous and lay in his tomb, his friend Lazarus. And he says, "Lazarus, come forth." And Lazarus wakes up and walks out of the tomb. And that's the moment you see here. You see Christ speaking, and you see the effect. Lazarus drawing his first breath after having died. And there's a sense of shock to his body here. Just been revived, he looks wide-eyed at Christ with a real sense of physical shock. There's also a stiffness to his body, which is lingering rigor mortis as warmth is returning to his body. And then you see the tint of his skin is similar to Christ in the other painting. This is Sebastiano's way of conveying that he had been dead. He has this deathly pallor to his skin. Of course, he's extremely muscular and powerful looking, unexpected for somebody who's been dead for 4 days, but that's Michelangelo for you. He presented ideal bodies for us, and Michelangelo made the drawings for this figure, for Sebastiano to paint, and you see two of them here on the wall. This painting was commissioned by a very powerful cardinal, Giulio de' Medici, who was the cousin of the Pope. Leo X was the Pope at this time, also a Medici. And it was commissioned in direct competition with Raphael, who concurrently with this was to paint a Transfiguration. That painting is now in the Vatican and was finished a little later than this. But the fact that the two artists were working so closely, neck and neck, competing for the same commission, or for painting altarpieces for the same destination, really intensified the rivalry between Sebastiano and Michelangelo. So between Sebastiano and Raphael, with Michelangelo sort of the third part supporting Sebastiano. So this really was his most important commission so far, and really in his whole career. This is the most important commission that Sebastiano received, and he really went to town on it, painting so many figures. And you can see it's a little confusing. There's so much going on here. And we have discovered through infrared imaging that actually, this figure you see here, as painted after Michelangelo's drawings, is a late addition. Initially, it was all Sebastiano. By the time that Sebastiano had painted most of this painting in 1517, Michelangelo was no longer living in Rome. He had gone to Florence to work for the Pope there, his hometown Florence. So he was not around, but he came back in January of 1518 to ratify a contract with the Pope. And he probably went to Sebastiano's studio and looked at this painting with him and thought, okay, so this is really impressive, but it's kind of difficult to figure out who Lazarus is here. He's getting lost in the crowd. He's not so memorable to look at. And let me do a drawing for you. And then he did these drawings that eventually made it into the painting. And you really have a memorable figure suddenly there. He's bigger than the others. If he were to stand up, he would dwarf even Christ. But he is the figure you remember. This powerful, stiff figure experiencing shock. And that is what Michelangelo really could do. He was incapable of creating a boring figure. And you always remember his figures. He arranges them. Nobody could touch him in the imaginative way he would draw the figure. And that's something Sebastiano benefited immensely from. Of course, then Sebastiano put his spin on it. He really very much interpreted Michelangelo's ideas rather than just following them slavishly. And here you see the reactions to the miracle. And this is quite interesting. You see Mary and St. Peter, for example, kneeling in front of Christ, having recognized the miraculous nature of what has just happened. You see the apostles behind Christ debating the miracle, some very startled, some absorbed, some discussing it. You see other bystanders shocked. You see these three ladies up there holding their noses at the smell emerging from the tomb. You see Martha, Lazarus' sister, overcome with awe and shielding her gaze from what has happened. And then you see the three attendants helping Lazarus out of his burial shroud, and they act like contractors solving a practical problem. So really you have a range of reactions to the miracle here. And what I think the point of that is that you, as the believer looking at this, are invited to discuss it and debate it and think about it with the figures inside the painting. And it's a remarkable take. The coloring is fantastic too. You see, it's really dramatically colored, and I think this is in part coloring adapted from Sebastiano's colors, Michelangelo's colors on the Sistine ceiling, the very dramatic, bright, high-key color range on the Sistine ceiling, but they're rendered in the Venetian manner, with real depth, with glazed layers of translucent paint, lending real depth to the coloring. For example, you see the lilac of Martha's dress there, with the red peeking through the blue. It's really subtly done, and you see the sun hitting the riverbank up there and coming through the brown leaves at the top. It's very, very atmospherically done, and this is what really Sebastiano mastered. This kind of technique. Now, I think we should go and look at some sculpture. Here. So, the resurrection of Lazarus is generally taken to be a prefiguration of the resurrection of Christ. And the resurrection of Christ is the promise that Christ will rise from the dead in redemption of all of our sins. And Michelangelo was obsessed with this motif of the risen Christ. He worked on it for his whole career in a variety of works. These two statues is one of his engagements with this idea. You see the first statue here. It was commissioned. It's a marble statue commissioned from Michelangelo in Rome in 1514. Well, he started working on it in 1514. It was made for a friend of his who was very involved in the most advanced progressive theological debates at the time, and there was a lot of this going around at the time. Everybody was talking about how to reform the church, how to integrate new ideas into the Christian message, and so on. And one of these was the idea of integrating classical form, classical statues, the form of classical statues, and using those to represent Christian ideas. So Christ here appears as an Apollonian, naked God. And it was very unusual to have a naked Christ at this time. But it's to show his humanity as beautiful, all his humanity, as beautiful, as ideal, reflecting the beauty of our souls. Michelangelo started carving this, and then he discovered, as he was carving it, that there was a fatal flaw in its head, in what would be its face. And you can see that over here. There's this black vein running down his cheek, as if he's crying blood. That's not intentional. That was a disaster for Michelangelo, who had to abandon the sculpture because he just could not face, so to speak, finishing this face of Christ with that vein in it. So he left it unfinished, and it was finished later in the 17th century by, we don't know who, a sculptor in the early 17th century. So the back, the left hand, and the face are not Michelangelo's, really. Then Michelangelo went to Florence, as I said earlier, in 1516 to work for the Pope on Medici projects, and wasn't able to fulfill this commission for a number of years. But through the persistence of the patron, he eventually delivered this, which was installed in Santa Maria sopra Minerva in 1521. This is not the original statue. This is a plaster cast from the 19th century taken from the statue, because you cannot borrow the original. The original is in the church and will not leave the church. But you see, this statue is very different from the other one, where the first one is self-contained, standing at rest, like a classical Greek sculpture, in what is called contrapposto. That is, weight resting on one leg and the other leg bent at rest. And the body is describing this S shape. This one is active. This is a dynamic Christ who is stepping forward and turning to look. And he's looking out at something. And what happens here is that this statue suggests a story going on around it. Something is happening. And he draws in the viewer. And this is really the beginning of Michelangelo working with multiple viewpoints on a statue. And if you look at it, for example, over here, he looks very different. He looks slender and very dynamic from this angle. And then as you walk around, you see his aspect change. Frontally, and then over here, where he is more powerfully standing. He's still moving, but he's more static from this angle. And this is very dramatic, and this is a dramatic development from the first to the second iteration. You see also the elbow and the arm bending in front of the chest, which is the same idea as you saw in the Lazarus. And Michelangelo started thinking about this statue shortly after having helped out Sebastiano with the Lazarus. So it's a motif that he worked with quite a lot at this time. Sebastiano helped install this statue in Rome when it came here. Michelangelo sent it from Florence, and Sebastiano helped him install it, and describes it in very vivid terms, in part the beauty of the knees, which were worthy of any just the knees alone were worthy of any statue in Rome at the time, including all the antiques. So it was high praise indeed, and this was a very famous statue for many years. It's perhaps less famous today, but I hope that through looking at this juxtaposition, which has never been done before, of the two statues, one will gain an increased appreciation for Michelangelo's engagement with this particular idea of the risen Christ. That's all I have for you now. I thank you for listening and for viewing this, and hope you will visit the exhibition in which there's much more to see. Great, fantastic works of art, some of which we haven't even seen on the periphery of this tour, including the great relief carving from the Royal Academy of the Madonna and Child with St. John the Baptist by Michelangelo, a great masterwork which opens the exhibition, and including great paintings by Sebastiano, and a recreation of the third great collaboration between the two artists, the Borgherini Chapel, which is a whole chapel that we recreated in the next room behind those doors. So please come and look at the exhibition. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.